Welcome in, everyone. Ready to ditch the history books and dive into something a little more, shall we say, off the beaten path?
Sounds right up my alley.
Today we're going deep into post-war Japan, but not the kind you find in textbooks. We're talking about the outsiders, the hustlers, the schemers, the ones who thrived in the shadows.
And believe me, their stories are crucial to understanding how Japan transformed during this period.
Exactly. And leading our deep dive today is Robert Whiting's Gamblers, Fraudsters, Dreamers, and Spies, a book absolutely packed with wild anecdotes.
It's one of those books that really makes you question what you thought you knew about history. These weren't just bit players. These outsiders, the spies, the gangsters, the con artists, they shaped Japan's economy, its culture.
I'm already hooked. So let's set the scene. 1945, Tokyo's in ruins, the war is over, and the U.S. occupation is in full swing. Paint a picture for us. What's the vibe?
Well, imagine this. A city trying to rebuild itself from the ground up. You've got American GIs everywhere, a power vacuum, a thriving black market.
Right, because where there's chaos, there's opportunity.
Exactly. It was like a Wild West in the East. You had ordinary people just trying to survive, bartering for basic necessities, while others saw a chance to get rich quick.
And it wasn't just like smuggling rice and sugar, right? Whiting talks about currency manipulation being rampant. How did that whole scheme work?
So the occupation authorities, they come in with this idea of imposing a fixed exchange rate for the yen.
Sounds reasonable on the surface.
Right, they probably thought they were preventing economic chaos. But what they actually did was create this perfect storm for, well, anyone who knew how to play the system.
Because they essentially devalued the yen.
Right, massively. So suddenly you've got all these guys, these arbitrageurs, realizing they can buy yen for cheap and trade them for dollars at a huge profit.
So it's like smuggling, but with money instead of goods.
Precisely. And this is where some of the most colorful characters emerge. Guys like Wally Gaeta, a real mover and shaker back then.
Oh, I love when you say mover and shaker. Give me the dirt. Who was this Gaeta character?
So picture this. Gaeta runs a nightclub in Tokyo, the Golden Gate. Swanky place. But behind the scenes, he's the kingpin of this currency exchange racket. Dollars, smuggled goods, you name it, Gaeta was your man.
It's amazing how these things intertwine. You mentioned ordinary people caught up in this too. Was it really a matter of trading family heirlooms for a bag of rice?
It wasn't always that dramatic, thankfully. But with rationing being so strict, even basic necessities like soap became luxury items. So the black market, it became this lifeline for a lot of people. Housewives, businessmen, everyone was touched by it in some way.
It's fascinating, isn't it? This idea that even amidst the chaos, there's this sense of adaptation, of people just trying to get by, make a living. Some out of necessity, others, well, maybe a little more opportunistic.
Human nature, right. And speaking of opportunistic, while all this is going on, you have another layer of complexity unfolding. Figures from Japan's wartime past, they're making a comeback.
Let's talk about awkward reunions.
It's more than awkward. It's a pivotal moment. See, initially, the U.S. wanted to completely overhaul Japan, demilitarize it, democratize it, push out anyone associated with the war effort. But then the Cold War heats up. Exactly. And suddenly, a democratic Japan isn't enough. They need an ally against communism.
So what do? Just change their minds?
Pretty much. And just like that, figures who were instrumental to Japan's war effort, even former Imperial Army officers, find themselves back in the game.
Talk about a plot twist. But it couldn't have been an easy transition. I mean, the resentment, the mistrust.
It created this incredibly volatile atmosphere. You're trying to rebuild a nation, heal these wounds, but the former enemies are now supposed to be partners. It's from this chaos that one of the most intriguing elements of this era emerges. The Cannon Agency.
Okay, so now we're talking covert intelligence units. Fill us in on the Cannon Agency.
So imagine this. A unit made up of American GIs, Japanese Americans, even some Korean Americans. And their mission, combat communist sympathizers. But this wasn't your average intelligence operation. We're talking sabotage, undercover operations, the works.
Sounds like something out of a spy thriller. Who is calling the shots?
That would be Jack Cannon, a former explosives expert from Texas, already in Tokyo when the war ended. He had this uncanny ability to uncover secrets, which immediately caught the attention of General Willoughby, the head of intelligence for the occupation.
And Willoughby, he was what, paranoid about the communist threat?
To say the least. So he sees Cannon as someone who can get things done by any means necessary.
No kidding. I read that one of Cannon's first moves was to break into the German embassy.
He did. Blew open their safe, actually.
Okay, now I have to know. What was in the safe?
Get this. evidence that the Soviet spy ring, the notorious one that operated in Japan during the war, it was still active.
Are you serious?
That discovery right there, that's what cemented Cannon's reputation. He had Willoughby's trust, carte blanche, to assemble his own team, and the rest, as they say, is history.
So we've got this covert team led by an explosives expert operating in the shadows of a Japan in total transition. Sounds like the perfect recipe for, well, let's just say things probably weren't all on the up and up.
You're definitely picking up what we're putting down. The post-war years saw a huge surge in all sorts of activities, but one of the most, let's say, impactful was drug trafficking.
Right, and Whiting doesn't shy away from that. He talks about how North Korea became a major player in all this. How did drugs get so entangled with the Cold War, and what were they calling it? The Cannon Agency's mission?
Well, you got to remember, North Korea, they already had a, shall we say, reputation when it came to the drug trade.
Right, not exactly a secret.
So they saw the chaos in post-war Japan as an opportunity. I mean, it was the perfect environment to flood the country with heroin and other narcotics.
So it wasn't just about profits then, they were using it as a weapon, basically.
100%. It was a calculated tactic to destabilize Japan, undermine the U.S. presence. And the Cannon Agency stuck dealing with this on top of everything else. Imagine trying to track these shipments, identify the players, all while trying to figure out how much of it was coming straight from the top in North Korea.
So wait, the Cannon Agency was actually tasked with fighting drug trafficking. I thought they were all about communist spies and all that.
They were, but that's the thing about this period. Everything was so interconnected. Espionage, organized crime, political agendas, it all gets really blurry really fast. The Cannon Agency wasn't just operating in the shadows. They were navigating a world where the shadows themselves were constantly changing.
Talk about a pressure cooker. I can't even imagine the paranoia. Who could
No.
you trust in that environment?
You're right, it was a pervasive feeling at the time. And it wasn't just the Cannon Agency. U.S. military intelligence was also knee-deep, trying desperately to cut off the flow of drugs.
It's a good reminder that behind all these geopolitical games, there are very real human costs. It wasn't just about ideologies. People's lives were being destroyed on both sides.
Absolutely, and it reminds us that the post-war period wasn't just about rebuilding. It was about navigating this incredibly complex web of cultural differences and misunderstandings. And Whiting, he really gets into all of that, especially when he talks about those two infamous trials, the Girard and the Quackenbush cases.
Right, those cases really capture the tension between the U.S. military and Japanese society. For those who aren't familiar, can you give us a quick recap?
So both cases involved American soldiers accused of killing Japanese citizens, and they became these huge flashpoints, really ignited anti-American sentiment. But they were more than just isolated incidents. They exposed these raw nerves, these deep-seated anxieties about the occupation, about cultural differences, about justice.
So let's start with the Girard case. If I remember correctly, a soldier was accused of killing a Japanese woman who was collecting scrap metal on a military firing range. What made this case so explosive, so to speak?
The killing was tragic, no doubt, but it was the question of jurisdiction that turned it into this international incident.
Because they had to figure out where to try him.
Exactly. Japanese court or U.S. military court. It became this tug of war, a very public display of the power dynamics at play.
And if I'm not mistaken, didn't the U.S. government ultimately hand Girard over to the Japanese authorities?
They did, but not without immense pressure from the Japanese public. It was a landmark decision, a huge symbolic concession.
But I imagine it didn't sit well with everyone.
You're telling me. It created this feeling of resentment, even betrayal, among some in the U.S. military.
They saw it as disrespectful to their service, their sacrifices.
Exactly. And then you have the Quackenbush case, which was a whole different animal.
That was the American wife accused of killing her husband, right?
Yep. And it provided this really unsettling glimpse into the lives of American families stationed in Japan. Beverly Quackenbush, the accused, she claimed her husband had been abusive, said she acted in self-defense.
So this case brought to light issues of domestic violence, something that wasn't exactly openly discussed in Japan at the time.
Precisely. And it forced people to confront these uncomfortable truths. For the U.S. military, it was a PR nightmare.
It shattered this facade they were trying so hard to maintain.
Exactly. And even beyond these high-profile cases, Whiting paints this picture of daily life where even simple interactions between GIs and Japanese citizens were just fraught with these misunderstandings. Like, he talks about how the phrase bakearo, which means stupid fool, was thrown around a lot.
I can only imagine.
It shows how easily these cultural differences, if not handled carefully, could escalate into conflict. And on the flip side, Whiting talks about how some Japanese referred to GIs as bargain counter soldiers.
Implying they weren't the best and brightest?
Pretty much. There was this perception among some that not all American soldiers were created equal. That some were, let's just, not exactly living up to that idealized image of America.
Which just goes to show these stereotypes cut both ways. And it wasn't just in daily encounters. Whiting argues that these stereotypes fueled the rise of a whole other kind of outsider, the con artist.
Oh, absolutely. They saw Japan, with its reputation for safety and honesty, as ripe for the picking.
And these weren't exactly small-time crooks, right? Whiting describes some pretty elaborate schemes.
Oh yeah, these guys were masters of deception, spinning these elaborate tales of fake investments, promises of easy riches. It was like a Shakespearean play, this collision of ambition and vulnerability.
He talks about this one character, Mr. T, who set up a fake weight loss clinic in Roppongi, who wakes up one day and decides to do that.
Mr. T was an opportunist, plain and simple, a former U.S. Air Force captain who saw a chance to cash in on the anxieties of a society rebuilding after war. Fake diplomas, miracle cures, the whole 9 yards.
And people actually fell for it.
Hook, line, and sinker. They were desperate for a quick fix, a shortcut to a better life. And alongside these con artists, you have an even more unsettling development. The rise of the Gaijin Yakuza, foreign gangsters infiltrating Japan's underworld.
Okay, things are about to get real. What was the draw for them?
Japan's economy, it was booming. And that attracted all sorts, including those with, shall we say, less than legal ambitions. These Gaijin Yakuza, they weren't afraid of the traditional Japanese gangs. They saw an opening in the market, a chance to profit from vices, from drugs to prostitution. It was a whole new level of disruption.
It's incredible to think about, this collision of cultures, ambitions, everything happening against the backdrop of a nation rebuilding itself.
Absolutely, and it wasn't just happening in back alleys and nightclubs. Whiting also tells the story of a figure who transcended all that. Sadaharu, the home run king of Japanese baseball.
Yeah, I know the name, but thinking about it now, in light of everything else we've talked about, his story takes on a whole new meaning.
Right. I mean, here's a man who achieved legendary status, broke Babe Ruth's home run record. But throughout his career, he faced so much prejudice simply because of his Chinese heritage.
He was born in Japan, right?
He was. But his father was Chinese, and for some people, that was all that mattered. It makes you think about how we define identity, especially in a place like Japan, which often values, well, let's just say, being a part of the group.
It's almost hard to fathom this idea that someone could achieve such incredible things, embody the Japanese spirit in a way, yet still be seen as an outsider.
That's exactly the struggle, and O's story really embodies that tension. He was breaking records, but never quite allowed to escape that outsider label.
And Whiting suggests it wasn't just fans or the media. Even within baseball, there were those who felt threatened by his success.
Yeah, he talks about this phenomenon called Code Red. Imagine this. Pitchers were allegedly told not to give any easy pitches, especially as he got close to breaking Ruth's record.
No way, really.
It's almost comical, this idea of celebrating a sports hero while simultaneously trying to keep him down. Talk about mixed messages.
It really reveals these underlying anxieties, doesn't it? This fear of, well, the other.
Totally. And in this case, it was a fear of a foreigner, even a Japanese-born one, surpassing a beloved American icon.
Wow. It's kind of a lot to unpack.
It is, and it reminds us that these issues of belonging, of cultural navigation, they weren't just happening on the baseball field. We see it in all these stories of foreigners trying to find their place in post-war Japan.
Like the women Whiting talks about, the ones who came to Japan looking for opportunities and ended up working as hostesses in nightclubs.
Exactly. These women were often treated as commodities, their stories overshadowed by this fetishization of the exotic. And then you have the other end of the spectrum. Foreign CEOs brought in to shake things up, inject new ideas into the Japanese corporate world.
But as Whiting shows, even with the best intentions, navigating those cultural differences, it's like walking a tightrope.
For sure. He uses the example of Michael Woodford, a British CEO who uncovered this massive accounting scandal at Olympus. Initially, he was praised for his honesty, but he was also seen as an outsider, someone who disrupted the Japanese way of doing things.
And that ultimately led to his downfall.
It's a cautionary tale, but it's also a reminder that these stories, these encounters, they force us to confront 100%. So yeah, the next time you find yourself labeling someone or something as foreign or other, maybe take a moment to consider the stories behind that label. You might be surprised by what you discover.
great advice to end on. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. It's been eye-opening, to say the least. Until next time.